Well done. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this online webinar, Making the Industrial Emissions Directive Fit for Delivering the EU Green Deal. My name is Agnese Ruggero, from those who don't know me, from Carbon Market Watch, and this morning I'm joined by Christian Scheibler, Industrial Production Policy Manager at EEB. And we're going to talk about the upcoming revision of the Industrial Emissions Directive. As you know, the European Commission will propose a revision of this directive. And while this is a regular update of the directive as per EU standard legislative process, it does come within the framework of the European Green Deal. And so it should be reviewed in this context and contribute to the objectives of the European Green Deal, so climate neutrality by 2050 and the zero pollution plan. The Industrial Emissions Directive is a key directive to tackle industrial pollution and has played an important role for so far, but a lot more can be achieved. And this revision represents a key opportunity to revise its rules, as well as creating synergies with between climate and environmental protection. The revision has already started, the revision process with the evaluation that then has followed, that has triggered, let's say, the evaluation of the directive. The public consultation is open now, has been since December, and it will close soon, actually, on the 23rd of March. And that's why we thought that we thought that would be useful to organize this webinar this morning to explain a bit the Industrial Emissions Directive in more detail for those who are not familiar with it, to be able to familiarize themselves with it. We'll go through the way it works today and the elements that are up for revision. We'll also discuss the barriers and opportunities that the current legislative framework provides for industrial decarbonization, industrial depollution, and we'll focus, of course, on the functioning of the Industrial Emissions Directive. But we'll also touch upon the interaction that this directive has with the emission trading system. So the format is that we'll have two presentations. First, Christian here, who's the expert on the Industrial Emissions Directive, will provide you with an overview of the legislation and the key elements for revision. And then I will proceed to illustrate the interaction between the Industrial Emissions Directive and the emission trading system, as well as our policy recommendations to reinforce both instruments. So this is a capacity building webinar, so there'll be ample time for you to ask questions. And in this respect, then I will just do a quick run through the housekeeping rules. So because we want an open and free discussion, we'll conduct this webinar under Chatham House rules. We will record it for reporting purposes, and we will share the slides with participants after the webinar. As always, everyone's familiar with webinars, we've done plenty. So to ask questions, you can raise your hand by either using the button or writing hand in the chat box, or type them in the Q&A box. If you want to speak, you can be made a panelist by Danielle is going to help me sort through the questions and enable people to speak. So if we have a good number of participants and everything is clear, I suggest we get started. So Christian, thank you for joining us, and please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Agnese. So I will just share my screen then, I guess, now with the presentation. I hope you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
And yeah. Agnese, I will not see the questions, so probably I will take them later, no?
Yes, so you can take them at the end of your presentation. If there is something really pressing, I'll just unmute myself and shout.
Very good. Okay, so hello everyone. I've been told to present some basics on the ID, and in particular in relation to two items, which is plastics and coal. So that's why I tried to put a few examples with some kind of plastics and coal link. So for those who never heard about this directive, I think there are some basics I should kind of give a quick input on. It's like the first one is there are a set of activities in this. It's the largest industrial activity, so it goes from agriculture, like the chicken and poultry farms, high intensive ones, by the way, up to I would say waste prevention activities, waste incineration. There's energy intensive industries in it. So in the Annex 1, you have the scope of the activities. Also chemicals industries is there. Well, you can have a look in the annex. So for those activities, you need to have a permit. And in terms of integrated approach, you will hear this word quite often from my end. I have maybe a different understanding of what it means. For me, it means that you have to look at all the different media. So there's an air relevance, there is a water relevance, and it's also looking at chemicals consumption, resource use. So it's not just about emissions, because if you look at the term industrial emissions, it's actually integrated pollution prevention and control. And it looks at all the environmental media, except the climate one. And I will go more into substance in this one later. The approach is first to prevent. So you prevent impacts, and where not possible, where not technically or economically viable, you then reduce the impact to a reasonable level. And I will go more into the BAT definition then. The permit you should have, the main aspect is the emission limit values. So with the revised IPPC directive, so there was an IPPC directive from '96, which has been revised. Those emission limit values have to be based on BAT. So BAT, it's not the flying bat, it's best available techniques. And this, I will also explain what this is about. So there's not just the technical requirements, but also the monitoring requirements. And also when you end the activity, there are soil remediation also obligations. So the permit should all include the full life cycle of the industrial activity. BAT, so I will have in the next slide more details around that, what it means, best available techniques. So there are some reference documents where the BAT content is being written down. And there will be some links here. You see there are something like 33 BREFs, some which are not binding. It's more reference documents for all the different activities. It covers around 50K, well, 50,000 activities, installations. So across the EU. Keeps on changing, but it's around 50,000. So this is how the Sevilla process looks like. Well, Sevilla process, why? Because it's being conducted by the European Commission. So it's the European IPPC Bureau. They are organizing this exchange of information in Sevilla. So that's why it's called Sevilla process, because it's based in Sevilla. But it's the European Commission, DGGRC, who are kind of leading that. You have also the EU member states, which are involved, and industry concerned plus environmental NGOs. And well, for the environmental NGOs, it's basically the EEB who kind of coordinate this for the NGOs. There are other NGOs who are also formal participants in this process, but they have been only involved in, for example, the chicken and poultry BREF, plus the large combustion plant BREF. So there are different phases in this review. Like the first one is the kickoff meeting, where you decide the scope, who will decide, who will decide what information is key environmental issues. So what is to be taken up in the BREF as being of relevance to the environment. So there are some criteria. We don't agree with the Commission on how you kind of focus on what you should look at, but this is where it's being decided at the kickoff meeting. Then you move based on the information you have designed, and the questionnaires are kind of key. You have very detailed questionnaires which go to industry, which are being filled out. Member states nominate what they call BAT candidates. So what are good performers, what are well performers. So here again, it has been moving a bit. Before it should be the best performers. Now it's well performers, which is an indicator that it's not going in the right direction, because normally you should always have the best performers and only one or two should be enough. But I will go into this later. You don't need the full kind of data sets of all the plants you can imagine in Europe. You just need the best performer plants, or on different pollutants, maybe it's relevant, or on consumption aspects, it's relevant. So this is where the member states come in. They have to decide what is a good performer plant and how will I check also the data being brought to the Sevilla process. So once you have done that, the European Commission, so they have BREF authors, normally 2 or 3, who will then draft something like a first draft based on the information they have received. And then the whole commenting goes. The main meeting is the final BREF meeting, I would say, because here you really decide on what is the BIT conclusions part, which is the binding part. Once this has been sorted out, and this can take 2 years up to 3 years, depending, well, this is the formal BREF rules, which say it should not be more than 2.5 years normally. This also depends on how much data is being brought to the table, how long it will take, the scope extension or not. But once you have done that, you will have a final BAT conclusion text. So this is the binding stuff, binding part, which can also be in itself 100 pages or more. And based on that, it will go to the forum. So there's this IID forum, which is it's an entity where all the stakeholders are present, where they can, based on consensus, and this is real consensus. So if just one stakeholder, like from industry or NGO, says no, you cannot change it, okay? However, it happened that even though, and this was the case for the large combustion plant BREF, they fiddled around some amendments, the commission, to get the vote through. So because there's a Article 75 comitology vote at the very, very end of this. Once it's voted, there will be translation, and then the BAT conclusion text will be translated in the official EU languages, and it will end up in the journal of the official journal of the European Union. So this is the whole procedure. You can look into the more details in the BREF review rules. So now going in the BAT definition itself, what does it say? So the overall is the most effective, so best is most effective in achieving a high general level of protection of the environment as a whole. So here again, you have the integrated approach. You have to look at all the aspects. Resource consumption is a bit lost. For the moment, climate protection is not part of the environment, but I will go back to this later. It's more like a political reason due to the EU ETS. Then there's a kind of balance, and here is like the little spiral where it moves. It's between the availability and the best. So available means it has to be economically viable and technically viable for the industry concerned. And here is the kind of the conflict, I would say, under what is best, and we say it should be technically best, feasible stuff, and available, which is economically viable to the industry and they can afford it. Techniques, very important. It's not just technology and the hardware, it's also about design, how it's built, how it's operated, so the activity, and how it's decommissioned. It's not just technology and end of pipe. People forget this quite often. What is also new, it's a max 4-year compliance deadline. I insist on the compliance. So once it's published in the official journal, the industry has 4 years to comply with the requirements. But there are some derogations. I will go back later to this. So what is BAT supposed to cover? There are some BAT criteria in Annex 3. So in the ID, you will see 12 criteria. I would just highlight a few of them with the green dots because I find them kind of interesting. So you have to use low waste technology. You have to use less hazardous substance. We think you should also produce less of them from the start. Number 3 is quite interesting. It's the circular economy before its time. I mean, it was from 1996, okay, where they designed this. So it's like, you have to recover, recycle substances, not hazardous substances, to optimize as much as possible the process. Consumption is very important, consumption of raw materials, so water and also energy, plus energy efficiency. And the overall kind of goal, number 10, is to prevent overall impact to the environment. There's a link also to accidents prevention, so Seveso 3 for those who know this. So you don't want chemical spills or accidents. So normally this should also be part of the BAT. Well, this is BAT criteria. I go now to a more typical industry versus NGO mantra. Like when we go into BREF discussions, what is the typical kind of arguments we have? So industries say, well, often it's not proportionate to the benefits. So you have traffic, you have other areas where it's more worth to focus attention on. I mean, this is often what we hear, and it's also, even you can technically reduce pollution, it's not affordable or it's disproportionate. And sometimes there's even a point, to be honest. It's not big. You can do a lot technically feasibly, but sometimes it's not affordable or not viable. We say, well, you don't have any proper cost internalization from the start. So there is no accounting of, for example, air pollution costs. There's no clear method in Europe. And also what we say, what really counts is the outcome, we don't care about a technical catalog because there's a lot of focus on techniques, you know, like I want to be able to choose whatever technical option to conduct my activity. And we say, no, you should choose the most effective technical option that delivers the least impact to the environment. For the ETS, a general issue we have, why don't we have CO2 in it? Why don't we have fuel switching obligations? Why don't we have always binding energy efficiency standards? I mean, we have sometimes, we still, is because industry says, well, we have the EU ETS. This is the right instrument to regulate greenhouse gases. You know, the market is the most cost-effective approach. That's why it should be just under the ETS, full stop. And then the double regulation is kind of connected to this. And we say, well, climate change matters. It's also part of the, you know, environmental protection. We have a fuel choice, but it's a number one. You know, when you remove or if you want to reduce air pollution, for example, SO2 is one good example. Of course, if you have sulfur in the fuel, you will have sulfur emissions. So the number one BAT is fuel switching. And we have a lot of BREF conclusions which says fuel choice is the number one you have to look at, but they don't go to the end of it. You know, they leave the options open to the operators and also member states to choose whatever energy source they want. This is a bit the problem. Well, and then also double regulation. We hear it in the chemicals context very much. For example, when we want to substitute more of those hazardous chemicals or chemicals of concern, they say, well, I would say even the Commission and member states sometimes plus industry, well, we have REACH who can do this. You know, why duplicate? Why do double regulation? And well, we say, well, BAT is to go beyond the legal expectations. So go a step further than REACH, faster, and also to link with the environmental quality standards, the EQS. So, for example, we need to achieve certain objectives. Water is one important one, a good chemical and ecosystem standards to be achieved by 2027. So how can it be that we even talk about mercury emissions, you know, at the stack or to the water, which don't fit to this EQS objectives? Then also we hear very often we need representative data. So it's not enough to have a few BAT candidates. We need geographical kind of but. I mean, I hear this more and more like from industry or representative data. And we say, well, if you look at the rules, just one plant is enough to set the BAT standard. And it can be from anywhere in the world, not just the EU. Okay, I will just skip the rest because you can read faster than I will read. So this is the kind of constellation. How does it look like? So here is a typical kind of, well, it's one example of how a BAT conclusion looked like for the lignite power plants bigger than 300 megawatt. So this is the upper range, it's at 175, and this is smaller 85 is here. Here you have a lot of data points which explain, okay, you can see the numbers in the LTP BREF. So this is from 2015, how these kind of ranges have been set. So you will see like there are different techniques which are being used, and this is for NOx. This is only primary measures for NOx control, so low NOx burners, flue gas recirculation, etc. And there is only one secondary, DeNOx, so SNCR, selective non-catalytic reduction, but there's no single SCR candidate in this. So that's why this graph is not so nice, but I will just give you an example here. The star for this BAT should be SCR. Why? I mean, selective catalytic reduction, they can reduce 85, 95% of NOx on top, okay? SNCR can just cope 50% of NOx reduction. So we said, okay, where is this star? You're missing this one. We provided data from the US. There's one plant which runs on lignite with SCR. So it's like in this area, okay? And a few more. We had one, and we still have one plant in Europe, which is in Slovenia, which also has SCR, but they have a huge permit limit, so it's 150, but it didn't start operating before March 2015. It was in the test run, so there's no data point there. So this is a bit of a problem. So here is like the tricky part, because you want to be in the range, and you will see age doesn't really matter, because you have a lot of plants which are even recent lignite plants in Europe, like Niederaußen, in Germany, for example, and then a few plants in Poland, Lagica and Patnov. They are also in this above the range, because why? They don't have any secondary controls. Okay, so they're not really good candidates. Still, I can explain you what happened. Why is it 175? It was just because Italy and France, they had a few plants, and it's still there, Enel Portuscuso from 2006. Okay, it's number 224. 224 is here. And they wanted to protect that plant. We said, come on, you can go to 120 with SNCR if you run it, or you even run the SCR, you know, expert judgment, we should cut the range at 120. But France protected this plant, Émilie Huchet. In the meantime, it's closed. It's number 99. Where is it? It's somewhere here. Okay. They said we cannot fiddle out 120. It's too difficult for them. And in the meantime, it closed. Okay, we have another one, which was in Saint-Ouen, in, I think it's Paris, which also made a fuel switch in the meantime. So this is the terrible reason why we got 175. We should have went to 120 max, but this is what, like, politics, you know? So this is the reason why we got cut there. Okay, enforcement issues, because I see the time flying, huh? So I jump. What is the problem is in the implementation, even if we have BREF standards, is they all align to the top range. So the lenient but all go to the upper range, 1-to-1. We have a very, very few exceptions at the member state level where they go, you know, to the real BAT. The one I mentioned before is smaller than 85 for SCR on lignite power plants. It should be lower than 85, but they all go to the higher range, or even further, they can get derogations. And on these derogations, it's the so-called 15.4 derogation. There's no harmonized method. So yeah, there's no kind of accounting how you calculate the costs, you know, air pollution costs. You don't look at the climate impacts. You don't look at the other aspects. So this is a bit very limited. It's very weak. And also, besides that, there's no sanction, no penalties system. Like if you look at UK, for example, they have higher penalties. If you go to Romania, you pay peanuts, you know, so you just breach the law. Why would you pay double-digit millions of euro to comply with the standards for the retrofitting? If you can pay 20,000 euro, I mean, I would just pay 20,000 euro as an operator and continue operating. So this is a big failure. And, you know, in the markets rule, normally it's 10% of the annual turnover from the whole company. This is a real penalty. This really hits. We don't have that in the ID. Failures, I will go a bit more into this. It's access to information and public participation. And then, well, those who work on power plants, there's a lot of transitional derogations they got away with. And this is also the enforcement issue, I would say. So here, access to information, I think the maps, it's improving over time. It's getting greener. So one important point here is the access to information about, you know, performance data. How open and transparently is it available? Can you check the permits? Can you check the compliance reports, etc.? I think it's a very important gap we have, because if we could compare better the operators, then it will do the job. I mean, more than, for example, stricter enforcement. And I will go back later into this one, but this is a key aspect. We want to have a centralized system at EU where we can compare and benchmark different operators with a few clicks, like the permit. You cannot compare the permits, for example, in a few clicks, what you can do in US. You can just, you know, select your sector, you can select your pollutant, click the search button, and then you will see like Canada, Mexico, and US. We need the same in Europe because we have a language barrier, and IT, I mean, they can, you know, fiddle out. IT, I mean, the digital age, we're not there yet. Coal-link, quick. So on coal, well, you know, probably the Lifting Europe Star Cloud report. So it's huge, like the benefit you could achieve by moving from the current baseline to the true BAT. It's like 154 million euro a day avoided health damage costs a day. Okay, if they would move to this true BAT, what we call true BAT is the stricter range here. And then the further reduction potential. This is from the EEA. There's a huge further reduction potential compared to the large combustion plant. Okay, this is, I should have said this, the graph on the left. We have the IPPC directive, the large combustion plant directive drove down on the 3 pollutants quite a lot. We are now here, and we can go further down, like 91% on SO2, 79% on NOx. Mercury is a huge potential, but only if we force on the strict lower range. And there's none of the lignite plants currently in Europe, besides one I mentioned before, Substance 6, which can manage the lower range because they don't have the abatement yet in place. One important point I insist on for the climate change campaigners is we have a BAT on energy efficiency ranges. Okay, for lignite, it's bigger than 42 to 44%. Boiler efficiency net. For hard coal, it's 46%. If we would just make that binding, those two, we can get rid of all the pre-22 boilers from now. Okay, I mean from now. We have to make it. Okay, so this is something very important for the ID review, to make this binding and also set the range 44% net, 46% net for hard coal. We can maybe say, okay, as from 2030, we don't want any plant below this, and they're gone, the old plants. Okay. Well, I have a good example, maybe on other areas which you would probably not expect on the BREF. There's a food, drink, and milk BREF. So sugar beets also uses still coal and fuel oil. So the target phase out for the fuel oil use and coal, I hope, would be in December 2023. So there are some new standards on SO2 in particular, that you should use, okay, fossil gas. That's what you should use instead of coal. So it's okay, the less worse. There's also some new kind of BREF, ferrous metal processing BREF conclusion, which is kind of going in the right direction, which is BAT is to use electricity generated from fossil-free energy sources. It's being opposed by a few member states like Italy and Slovakia and Czech Republic, because again, EU ETS is the magic market approach. We shouldn't like regulate this kind of things in a BREF, but it's part of the kind of current BAT conclusion, which is kind of forward-looking. Finally, you know, it's not just end of pipe on air pollution reduction by some filters, but also switching away to electricity, for example. And this is based on one reference installation in Sweden. So I'm kind of happy and proud that we made it. You know, it was with a few member states' support we made this as a BAT. It's not voted yet, but I think it will go through. Okay, the good, the bad, and the ugly you can check out in our industrial plant data viewer, which the link is provided here. You know, we have done the data check because it's so terrible at EU level to compare plants. We have done our own system, our own database, where you can check and compare the biggest large combustion plants, worst in category, lowest in category, and you see that some countries which are kind of way beyond the BAT, but it's based on 2018 and 2019 data. I have to double check if this is still true, but there are quite a lot of plants which are really beyond the BAT limits. Okay, some quick words on impacts for PVC, because I was, plastics. So I think there are a few BREFs which are interesting for the PVC discussion. Well, the first one, I would say chlorine production is a basic ingredient for many chemical downstream users, but also for PVC production. We have a negative but there. So mercury cells is prohibited to produce chlorine. And the deadline was December 2017. It hit quite a lot on those plants like Ineos and Innovin, for example. They had to convert, and they were like some outages. And I think here we made some good move. There was also some negative but on asbestos to be used in diaphragm cells. But there's only one plant in Germany. It's Dow Stade. Huge chlorine production. I think 240K production volume. There we didn't, I mean, it was not closed, of course, because of that, because they still used asbestos in the diaphragm, but it was REACH, actually, for those who are here familiar with REACH, they made a side exemption to this BAT conclusion via the REACH route to still keep that asbestos diaphragm still operational for, I don't know what, 2024 or something like that. So here it was like a bit the weird situation that the BAT was stronger than the REACH restriction. Okay, waste incineration, it's quite interesting as well, because PVC, they don't want to burn it because of the HCl parameter. So there's a lot of chlorine in it. It affects the hardware of the waste incineration plant. So, well, I have heard from other people from Zero Waste Europe that, you know, it's a problem that PVC goes to the waste incinerators, but normally they don't like this kind of stuff. And also because the HCl is kind of strict level, so they have a problem to cope with this if there's a high share of PVC. Then there's a pre-sorting BAT 9. You can look into details. We have made some implementation brief for NGOs if you want to look a bit more around that, where you can also remove the PVC and the plastics and the sorting upstream. Waste treatment is quite relevant, I think, also for the plastics, because there's a kind of waste treatment BREF, so how you treat waste, and it's very relevant to the so waste electronics. So what you should do. how to treat it properly. There's a huge issue with diffuse emissions, so like defragmentation, stuff exploding like that, the plants, because there are some impurities, but it's more for metal shredders. And there's a lot of PCB emissions just from that. Sometimes you will be surprised, it's worse than an iron and steel plant. If you have a small shredder plant, which is taking a lot of vehicles, which are end-of-life vehicles, it explodes quite often. Stuff is floating in the air, and it's worse than an iron steel plant. Okay, WGC BREF polymers, it's ongoing. So this is the air emissions from chemical industry. So there are some crazy levels proposed on the VCM, worse than even the voluntary commitment by the plastic industry. So this we had to get fixed. This is just an example that it's still ongoing BREF. LVOC BREF, I want, I have 5 more minutes, or I'm over time, huh?
No worries.
Okay.
Really, it's very interesting. So keep going.
Okay, good. You make some sign, huh? So LVOC BREF, there's a deadline. Also, it's this year, so I want to highlight this. There's some kind of opportunities. Maybe it's a few plants would probably, I don't know if it's true, but Spain were really upset about it. They said some Spanish plants will close because TVOC, so it's total volatile organic carbon, yes, TVOC pollutants, the parameter. So this forces basically thermal oxidizers. So this level, 5 milligram, you can only manage with thermal oxidizers. If you have catalytic oxidation, which is the other technique they have, you are more in the 15, 10 or whatever range, but you cannot cope with 5. So I just know that for those, I have some names in the backup slides. You can check for yourself. I guess it's Spanish plants, and the names you will see, will probably have to either close or make very, very big investments. And also, they have to make the natural gas infrastructure. They have to get gas for destroying. It's carcinogenic air pollutants, basically. Okay, and here it's a bit of a dilemma. Maybe it's a good example for the climate people as well. So here, the EEB is rather interested to reduce or prevent nasty carcinogens to get to the air. Okay, and the way you destroy it, it's by using thermal oxidizers, which consume fossil gas. So this is a bit of a trade-off again of the BAT. It's a typical example that where you say, oh, what is more important? Natural gas is not good for the climate, I know, but on the other hand, you have these very bad carcinogenic pollutants we don't want to have in the air, so we want to destroy them. So this is a bit a dilemma example, I would say. Yeah, okay, I just mentioned these two reference plants, 6 and 11. You see the TVOC level is beyond the 5. There's one which is extreme, 51. And there are some few others, incinerators and even thermal oxidizers, which probably are not maintained very well. Okay, so you have to check those plants. Deadline is very soon. So they're probably either derogating or they are updating the permit. So have a check. I think the other interesting parameter is the NOx parameter all the time on the crackers. So the low olefin crackers or other crackers, there's this hardly any secondary abatement on the crackers, so on the NOx parameter. So this is something to look out for. Well, then textiles, moving to something which is ongoing. So I think here we have an opportunity to define what a microplastic is. I mean, it's also part of REACH. But this is also something where we have currently 2 BATs where micro plastics will be addressed indirectly. As you know, 1/3 of the plastics pollution, like the microplastics pollution, is from synthetic textiles. So it's abrasion, and then it goes in the washing machine, it flushes out of the washing machine, it ends up in the water, etc., etc. So one thing we can do is to prevent at the site where they produce textiles, the release of synthetic textiles. So one way would be probably to have some abrasion standards or pre-washing cycles at the site before they sell the stuff out of the, before it leaves the site boundary. They should first do some pre-washing cycles, keep the micropollutants and deal with this at the source. They can do it with membrane filtration. Question is, should we require it for all the synthetic fiber production sites? I don't know. But the main parameter here is the TSS, so total suspended solids. It's quite a huge range. 5 to 45 is the current BREF review. Well, on the right side, typical problem. At the kickoff meeting, we said microplastics is an issue. We have to set some standards there. And well, the Bureau says we didn't have enough information available to conclude on whether it's significant first, and two, what we can actually do about it. So if you have any more information out, how to prevent pollution at the source, abrasion standards, depollution, pre-washing cycles, whatever, please send it to my colleague Jean-Luc Vitor, who is in charge of this BREF. Okay, timeline, ID. So we are currently here. 23rd of March, the open public consultation will close. There's also something happening in parallel, which is the targeted stakeholder survey. The red curve is the influence curve. I think this is the main and important stage. April up to September, it's influencing the targeted stakeholder survey, the member states, feeding into the impact assessment. What are the right questions the Commission should ask themselves, and the different policy options they have to consider them for a new proposal. We think in December or possibly November, December, we will have the formal ID proposal out. I don't think it will be after the summer break, but it should be rather in this kind of time frame. There's a lot of parallel routes and avenues to explore and to push the 8th EAP. I think it's very important for the access to information deficit. We want to have something really strong on the access to information part. And there's a PRTR, so Pollutant Release Transfer Register review as well, in parallel, where we want to push this idea about, with a few clicks, you can compare permit limits, mandatory reporting on energy and input consumption, the mandatory reporting about, for example, the continuous emission monitoring data, so we can really know where are they, the plants. The Zero Pollution Action Plan, it's out in May. So it's a lot of stuff going in parallel, EU ETS review as well. Another important stuff for the people working on coal, Minamata regulation is up for review. So we want to push here again the real BAT, 1 microgram. Okay, remember, one microgram is the limit to air. And also some kind of mercury in fuel ban for lignite intense, for the high mercury containing lignites, we should ban them to burn this stuff. Okay, so this is, I think, the kind of timeline I want to be. Okay, now the fun part. Time for beer. Well, it's a bit of a joke because in this Industrial Emissions Directive work, it's a lot of guys working on it, and we said maybe if we have a new title, they would be probably more interested to kind of push it in the right direction. So the best industrial environmental performance regulation or zero pollution industrial production regulation should be the new kind of title. Regulation, why? Because we want to restrict the flexibility of member states. It's one of the weaknesses, the main weaknesses, I would say. There are standards, but member states do whatever they want to derogate from them or kind of tweak them to satisfy the national industry interest, I would say. I mean, it's very blunt what I say now, but it's one of the failures, and also because why we don't have a level playing field. I mean, you have some countries which are more advanced in the BAT uptake. If I can name Austria, Belgium, sometimes Germany, depending on the sectors. Well, and then the others are kind of more catching up. Sweden, they claim they are the front runners, but if you look, they have quite some derogations as well. I was quite surprised to see how many derogations they have. But okay, why this pentagram? Because you have like the different actives, the integrated approach. So soil, resource consumption, energy, air, and water have to be tackled. And I think what we really need to push there is the NGO spirit. So the NGO spirit has to make its ways in all those areas. So what could it be? The NGO spirit. So I would say one fundamental game changer, and this is the red stuff, really the big traffic, how you call it, the big Baustelle, the big thing we have to fix in the IED is a scope redesign. So what do we mean with this? So instead of regulating the worst activities because of their impact, like, for example, large combustion plants bigger than 50 megawatts, what do we want from the industry? We want outputs and useful service. So we want, in this case, energy. Yeah. So this is what we want: energy, heat, or electricity with the least environmental impacts. So instead of saying, okay, we're going to lower the threshold to 20 megawatts, I mean, it will be probably done to align to ETS. We want to say, no, it should be energy generation is like what we want to compare. And then we can look at different aspects. Also, do we want a biocides and pesticide BREF? It's only about looking at the chemical options. We should also look at the non-chemical options. So integrated pest management, for example, soil fertility and this kind of thing. So we want to really go a bit further than this. Another key aspect is the BAT determination methods. As I said before in the graph, there's no technical feasibility kind of obligation. There's no kind of clear rules on how you cut the best from the rest, I would say. Yeah, so there's no clear rules. We want to set some more clearer rules, and I think industry even agree on some parts with this. Maybe they want in a different direction, but I think it's a bit, sometimes we win, sometimes they win, and there's no clear method. And I think it merits to have a clearer method. Maybe we can even have a two-stage BAT, for example, on the climate, on the real deep process changes where they have to, just get rid of the current production method and change it to something else. There we need a more forward-leading BAT. We need maybe more than 4 years to, for the industry to adapt. So we can have a differentiated approach there. So this is one of the big game changer changes. To restrict flexibility, as I said, I think we need more power in the standard making and adoption process, because for the moment it's member states who vote, so they have the real power, and the Commission. The link to the environmental quality standards is not so obvious. For example, power plants, lignite power plants in Bulgaria, all of them, they got derogations on the mercury. Yeah, how can it be? We have a Minamata Convention. We have 90% of the BIOTA standards. So BIOTA is the fish tissues are exceeding the mercury limit in the water. How can it be to even add further mercury? I mean, this doesn't make any sense. But for the moment, this link doesn't really work well. The benchmarking tools I mentioned before, EPRTR, very important. How we can rate, how we can compare the different industries. So this is something kind of, where we can also pull maybe for the front runners, if we have even a BAT label, I don't know, for those which are really good, the really good guys or girls, like operating a nice industrial activity, they should have a label maybe. I don't know if this can work. And then the other kind of fundamental on the right side, I would say internalization of external costs. It doesn't happen at all for the moment. We need also the combined approach, so EU ETS to work together with the benchmark approach. So not just the market. I mean, the invisible, hand of the market can help, but we need a bit of a stick sometimes to also help. And here the BREF and the ID can help, I think, to give the stick. So what is the minimum expectations? Target setting, yes. I think on certain media goals, we need clear targets. Where do we want the industry to go by when? Some expectations. For the moment, it's like derogations, for large combustion plants, which are transitional. There are some outdated directives which are in the ID. We want to replace all of those EU safety nets by something more forward-looking. And then also the dynamic instrument we're missing. So prevention at source, how we can promote front runners. It doesn't have it, because for the moment, it looks very much backwards. What is the data showing, what they can do, instead of how we can promote like the front runners. So if we get those two, kind of the fundamentals and the principles, then we can really deliver, I think, on the zero pollution ambition. I think we will also end the technology neutrality dogma, because for the moment, we know certain options are better, more effective, but we should really stop like the free choice for industry in certain ways to really push in a certain direction. Well, I think this is like the main thing. And what I wanted to close on is to, we have a joint petition on cleaning up the industry. The website is here. So we have 7 days to go still to sign up. If you didn't, please, the petition. And well, and then I have a lot of backup slides if you want to look about, the plants I mentioned before on the plastics in Spain, which are affected. You can have a look, and more links on reading materials. Okay, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Christian. So it's a very complicated, very long directive, and this is a very dense presentation. So thank you very much. I'm sure that people will need some time to digest it, but what we wanted to achieve is for you to have a flavor of the key elements, an idea. And I think Christian has run through some examples from different sectors of how the Industrial Emissions Directive regulates different pollutants to different media, such as water, air, and land. So how these limits are set through the Sevilla process. how certain member states behave. Some are more ambitious than others. Some are pushing to keep the limits very high so that to protect certain plants in their countries. And finally, how this approach can be fine-tuned and redefined through the revision, some core components in red, some other sort of ancillary but complementary tools, like I will explain in a minute, on how the Industrial Emissions Directive can complement other directives such as the emission trading system. So I'd like to take some questions because I saw them popping up on the chat. So for example, starting with Jeremy, who asks, 2 to 3 years to publish, update a BREF looks very long compared to the speed of technology, as well as practices and policy improvement. Is there a plan or political interest to make it more proactive?
Okay, well, Jeremy, good question. I would say it depends on what technology you're talking about. If you are switching from, like, let's take the ferrous metal processing example or other chemical industries. If you want to switch to electrification, it will not be 2 or 3 years. It's like a 20 years investment, you know, cycle we are talking about. For the industry, they think about 20 years. So it also depends on what you're talking about. So for example, if it's about the retrofitting a plant, you know, with some filter dust or SCR, whatever, it takes 6 months, true, 6 or 8 max to implement that. Well, the 2 or 3 years, unfortunately, it depends also on how fast the commission is, and there's a lot of delays happening. Sometimes, you know, also pushed quite a lot by industry to delay it a bit further, so they win a bit of time. So then it's a max 4-year deadline to implement. Okay, the deadline for compliance is max 4 years. It doesn't have to be 4 years. It can be much shorter. Well, there is some concept which is called emerging techniques. So even if it's not established BAT, so stuff which is being in development phase, for example, which is under research, there's a chapter on this, which also takes those emerging techniques up. And this is also what we say, that we miss a reality check before we get to the adoption, like 3 years later, as you say. We should have a reality check before we kind of approve it if it has emerged in the meantime. But this is not happening for the moment, but there's some plans to do this. Is there some political interest to make it more proactive? Well, I don't know. I mean, for example, under decarbonization, I would say you would really have to say a direction. We want to achieve certain deep changes in the industry by a certain date. I mean, on the iron and steel sector, we know they can make it up to 2025 if they would have some economic support schemes to, you know, do the direct reduction, for example. Yes, some are ready, some are not, some we have to push. So I think this is why I mentioned before, we need some kind of planning, but where we say by this deadline, we want you to do this and this and this and this. If this answers the question, and I can maybe take the next one from Adrian, which is a bit connected. When a permit is delivered, how long is it valid for? I mean, this is again a story of member states. For the moment, it's a lot of countries have it unlimited. There are a few exceptions like Greece or I don't know, other countries where it's 5 or 10 years max deadline. But for many, it's unlimited. However, when you have a new BAT conclusion coming, you have to update and revise the permit. So there's a kind of a trigger, there's an automatic trigger. And this is also an interesting debate, because often, like, we hear these concepts of grandfathering and, you know, like Bestandsschutz in Germany. Often they claim, oh, we have invested now in something, you know, which is like 20 years return of investment time. And now suddenly you come with this bloody BREF asking us to do like lower, like 20% lower. It's not reasonable. And they often play this kind of game as well. But I think here it's very important for us NGOs to say it's not a permit to do something, because BAT is moving over time. So we can revoke your permit anytime, or the competent authority can revoke it anytime, and they can always expect more.
As a follow-up from that, just so that we have all the sort of timeline clear, how often are BATs reviewed?
So the directive says it should be every 8 years. You should finalize the new kind of version. So there's a kind of, it's a recital. It's a week. it's a weak obligation, and that's why it doesn't happen. You know, I mean, just the LTP BREF, for example, it was from 2006. We got the new version in 2017 only, but now the court has said, because of a stupid formal mistake, they have annulled it. So we have to start over again for this kind of reason. So it very much depends also on which BREF we are talking about. Some are not revised, but normally it should be every 8 years. And that's why sometimes it's maybe more effective to not review a permit, but to go through the EU safety net approach and the ID revision. For example, on power plants, large combustion plants, we as EB, we don't want a new BREF on LCPs, which will lower a bit the emission. I think we should push directly through the ID review some meaningful emission limit values, which will kill like the coal combustion in Europe by 2030, ideally. But also for the intensive pig farms, for example, pig and poultry rearing, the levels are so extreme that many operators don't have to do anything. So we would not wait for a new BREF to come. Maybe we can fix it in the ID, for example, the manure spreading, the air pollution, methane, and these kind of things. We can take it up now.
Okay. Then we have a question from Yannick. What do you recommend to do with PVC? Shall we landfill it?
I don't know. Frankly, I have no opinion on this. Yannick, you probably know it. Well, landfilling depends. I mean, the PVC also now they say we should recycle it to a certain level for the PVC window frames. You know, instead of producing virgin material, we can use the old PVC to replace the production of new one. I would say the first thing would be not to produce it. We have to stop at the source, like close the robinet, to not produce it. And then once you have it, you should of course recycle and maximize the reuse cycle. There are always pros and cons for anything, you know, like the waste incinerator people will say, well, we can use a fraction. We will not use anyway much because of the chlorine content, but we can reuse the energy. So that's energy recovery because we do district heating. If you put, but then there will be air emissions, of course, which have air pollution impact. If you landfill it, it will be in the landfills, and that's it. So I don't want to like say something because I don't know actually honestly what is the right solution for PVC.
Okay, so I have one last question for now. How will the cost of pollutants from burning fossil be decided? We need high levels of cost and alignment with national regulations, I believe.
Well, from EB end, well, we have it's linked to the valuation of externalized impacts. So I would say from burning of fossil fuel, first I would say we should look at the whole chain. So the minimum expectation on carbon pricing is at least 100 euro. I would say per ton of CO2 equivalent. This is the minimum expectation. Now people say it's even 180. I mean, this should be this is the real cost of the CO2 emission. So I think we should internalize it. So this should be like a shadow price. We could push via, for example, the derogations. If they want to give derogations to some fossil fuel combusting installation, they should assume a shadow price of that level before even giving the derogation, because you know there's this cost benefits discussion. So this would be the expectation in the background. Then I would say we can also, I mean, I would say this is the job of the EU ETS, who should fix that. But also, for example, if you have lignite mining, there's the water cost recovery principle under the Water Framework Directive. And we have brought out a publication, Mind the Gap, where we show that almost none, except a few exceptions, they never ask the operator to pay for the water abstraction. So they get it for free. So this is also one example of non-cost internalization. So we should also force the implementation of this water cost price. I would even say if you burn fossil fuels, depending on which type, if it's coal or lignite with heavy mercury content, who will pay the remediation of the surface waters, you know, to get to the good chemical status? Who will pay for it? It should be the polluter, no? So we should also then internalize this kind of damage costs, I would say, for any future pollutant. But as you see, and as you know, the costing of taxation, it's it's mainly the member states' responsibility. So there's a nice example, I think, in Sweden, and I think the Norwegian NOx fund, for example, where they pay a charge when they pollute air pollutants, and they also have to pay for that. And then you reinvest in the solutions. I think we need more of those systems in Europe. What I just mentioned before was something which the Commission can do because it's under the EU control. You know, like for example, on the value of statistical life is one method on how you evaluate air pollution costs versus another method which is factor 3 lower. So whatever method you choose, you underrate air pollution and the impact it has on health. Just to close that, in US, the citizens are worth 3 times more than we EU citizens in terms of air pollution exposure. It's a political decision which has been taken in Europe, and I think we need to fix that.
Great. We have one more question, actually. So Tim asks, what revisions should we demand during the ID revision to ensure that discharge limits on pellets plastic pollution is a required obligation for polymer producers in an updated BREF? Is there scope to get such discharge limits on converters and distribution centers?
Just trying to understand the question. Okay. Well, that's a bit of a gap as well in terms of BREF in general. Like the BREF normally, they regulate whatever is within the kind of operator's control. That's how they call it. Okay, so there's a kind of side boundary limitation. We say that it should also cover the product's use phase. So there's a kind of extended producer responsibility. But then, of course, how a certain polymer release, if it's in like is happening on like in a domestic source, I think it's very difficult to capture that. So we can only in the BREF context, for example, the textile I have mentioned before, we can say, okay, you can maybe have the membrane technique for total suspended solids, not to enter the water. We would require pre-washing cycles for the synthetic fiber production. Okay, but this is not intentionally added microplastics. Okay, it's like the shredding. For the one you mentioned, the plastics pellets production, frankly I don't know how this works, but probably it's part of the in the sector itself. They would have to always prevent impact to the environment. So or no release. Okay, so you can give us more input about what is this pellets like release happening? Where is it being released from? You know, at what production phase? And then we can address it in the BREF, or normally it's the job of the permit writer, the enforcement authority, to make sure that there's no release to environment. So it's like the BREF on one hand, it's paper, but really happens with the paper on the ground, it should be the job of the competent authority. So I would advise you to first approach the competent authority to deal with the problem. And then if they say, oh, it's not part of the BREF, then get back to us and tell us what's wrong. I don't know if this answers your question, maybe not, but I tried.
All right, thanks, Christian. I'm not seeing any more questions at the moment. So as it's already almost 12, maybe I'll just move to my bit of the presentation. You'll stay with us, so if there are more questions later on, we can address them. I'll just share my screen. All right. All right. So basically, this is why the climate community and specifically carbon market watch has started looking more into the detail of the Industrial Emissions Directive and started collaborating with the EEB on this matter. I'll just run through with something that we've already seen. Christian has explained, so the main elements of the Industrial Emissions Directive, and how it combines with the emission trading system. Many mentions of this have been made in throughout Christian's presentation. So I'll just try to sort of like wrap up and clarify some of the issues and outline our policy recommendations for the upcoming review of the Industrial Emissions Directive. So as we've just seen, indeed, the Industrial Emissions Directive covers 50,000 or thereabouts large industrial installations, has the objectives of reduce and eliminate pollution arising from industrial activities, and it's based on the pollution prevention principle, as Christian explained. The performance, it's based on best available techniques that are periodically reviewed, the BREF. We've talked about all this. So this is how this directive functions. Now, the emission trading system, I know some of you are familiar with this directive, is a directive that also looks at industrial pollution, although only greenhouse gas emissions. It regulates only 11,000 of power stations and industrial plants, plus the airlines. The objectives behind the emission trading system are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by putting a price on carbon. So it's indeed a market-based cap and trade system where the overall limit on the greenhouse gas emissions is for the whole of Europe, and it's for all of the installations covered. That is a cap that declines each year, which means that less allowances are available, and therefore emissions are reduced over time in line with the European climate targets. So the principle is different from the ID because it's not pollution prevention, but it's polluter pays principle. So the installations covered by the ETS are required to buy emission allowances on auctions on the market that correspond to the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that they emit. In practices, one allowance corresponds to 1 ton of CO2 produced. What is the main issue with the ETS? So why are we looking at an integrated approach with the Industrial Emissions Directive? Because even if the principle of ETS is to reduce pollution where it's more cost effective, it has not worked very well on industrial sectors. So it has worked on the power stations, so in the power sector. It has worked less on in the industrial sector, and this is mostly due to the fact that while allowances are auctioned, so bought by the power sector, they're not all bought by industry, because still nowadays more than 90% of industrial greenhouse gas emissions are covered by ETS emission allowances. Now, for those who again are familiar with this directive, they will know, or just as a short explanation, how free allowances are allocated to industries. They're allocated based on benchmarks that are calculated on the basis of the 10% best performing installations in the EU, and have yearly efficiency improvements, which are quite low, but still they're supposed to strengthen or incentivize emissions reduction and innovation and reward the most efficient installations. The way they're set today, they're not effective in doing so. And some of the examples that I'm going to show you of emission pathways just in a moment. The issue here is that the Industrial Emissions Directive, on the one hand, tackles all pollutants in an integrated approach, but as we've seen, it does not address greenhouse gas emissions. It protects the environment, but does not address climate pollution directly. The EU ETS, on the other hand, does cover greenhouse gas emissions, but gives virtually no incentive for industry to actually reduce their emissions. The ETS benchmarks are aimed at strengthening the incentives, but they have not worked so far. They're also aimed at preventing carbon leakage, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this term, but they have not given the right incentives, and industrial emissions are stagnating. And as I mentioned, here are some examples. For example, we looked at bulk chemicals. As you can see, there's been a bit of fluctuation. Of course, 2007, 2008, and there's been the financial crisis, so some emissions have reduced here, then have gone from up and down. And here, since 2013, they're pretty much stable and not moving, except, okay, 2019, then they will probably have some reduction visible in 2020 because of coronavirus, but it's not because of the efforts put by industry in reducing their emissions. Other examples, steel. It's the bars are orange, but you can see the difference. And here again, since 2009, there was a reduction in output, then the emissions go back, and then from 2010, 2013, in the last 10 years, there is virtually no reduction. Same for cement as well, and a graph that was shared already by Christian here in his presentation, but here I'm showing you the level of CO2. If you look at the red line, again, while all other pollutants have some form of reduction, then maybe another peak, and then a solid reduction since 2010, the CO2 emissions are flatlining, and they still consider, to go to the reduction is between -1% plus 1%, and at this rate, we're not going to reach solid emissions reduction to put us on a pathway to climate neutrality by 2050 at the latest. Right now, the ETS cap will actually drive, so we'll reach 0 by 2058. So we'll definitely need to pick up the pace and find complementary tools to the ETS, because ETS alone cannot deliver emissions reductions that are needed. On top of not being effective, I would like to underline the fact that the allocation of free allowances in the past, and we're updating the study, has actually generated profit for industry. As you can see here, between 2008 and 2015, the iron and steel industry has made 8.4 billion euros in profit from over allocation of allowances, 5 billion cement, 4.6 billion for refineries. So it's quite substantial profit on the back of the climate, and while not having reduced emissions virtually at all. So the issues to solve, in the sense, what can then be done through the Industrial Emissions Directive? We've seen that if we start regulating CO2 through the permitting, the environment permitting, so set emission limits that include also CO2. And the other element that can be used in the Industrial Emissions Directive is the performance-based energy efficiency standard, which Christian already mentioned earlier, that can lead to fuel switching, for example. These are, at the moment, exist in the Industrial Emissions Directive, so it's not something that needs to be added, but they're not binding. So what we would like to see is that they're made binding and not optional, not at discretion of member states whether to apply them or not. So the combination, and here I will show you the policy recommendations. So the combination of including greenhouse gas emissions in the Industrial Emissions Directive, so for a plan to operate, for a permit to be granted or renewed, emission limits on also greenhouse gas emissions could be included. So this is done by deleting Article 9.1 in the Industrial Emissions Directive. So in this upcoming revision, there is also the need to delete Article 26 of the ETS Directive. These two articles are basically saying if installations are covered in the emission trading system, then their greenhouse gas emissions are regulated in by that directive, by ETS. So they cannot be regulated in the Industrial Emissions Directive. So by deleting these two articles, and we can achieve the reintroduction of greenhouse gases in the Industrial Emissions Directive. So no mutual exclusion. The Article 9.2 instead of the Industrial Emissions Directive would introduce minimal binding energy efficiency standards based on best-in-class solutions within within a given industrial activity. And when they are already available, they can just be enforced. The end result, so what we want to achieve with this asks, is that by introducing greenhouse gas performance standards, we can achieve a complete coal phase out in Europe by 2030 and industrial decarbonization faster. So actually in line with climate neutrality before 2050. This is something that Christian has already showed you, but just as a recap, we've had the evaluation of the Industrial Emissions Directive, the inception impact assessment, public consultation now open, closing in a week, and then the European Commission adoption foreseen for the fourth quarter. Those who are more in touch or more regularly in touch with EGMV consider November, December as a likely time for the proposal to come out. So with this revision, we have the opportunity to ask concretely, at least from the climate perspective, that the articles that limit or pose a barrier to the implementation of ETS and IED be removed. So what's important, what we've launched also together with EEB and Frank Bolt and Client Earth and others, we've launched this petition that was shown before. It's also to ask for this, to include greenhouse gas emissions under the Industrial Emissions Directive, to put a limit, not only a market-based system to reduce emissions, but also a limit on what can be emitted by industry. So I hope that was clear enough, and I'm happy to answer questions. Yes, we'll share the presentations later, no worries. Okay. I guess, so like I said, you can feel free to ask questions if you don't have any at the moment. We will follow up with, okay, hang on. I think I just got one. What CO2 limits are you thinking of? So that's the ongoing discussion that we're having with Christian at the moment. Yeah, if you have concrete examples of this that you'd like to share, the idea would be, and it's going to be a difficult discussion in certain instances because there are certain limits depending on the sector and the type of activity. So every sector and activity will have different limits, but we'll basically put a stop to certain plants. And that's why there is going to be a slightly difficult conversation to be had. For example, the just transition that we talk about in the power sector could be applied to energy intensive industries, because there are some plants, like the worst emitters, that will have to either completely overhaul their production processes or shut down. And if they shut down, then we'll have to also consider and support the consequences, such as job losses or upskilling and reskilling of workers and so on, some financial support. Like, it's going to be pretty much the same discussion that we're having in just transition in the coal phase out. Christian, would you like to elaborate on your 120 grams per kilowatt?
Yeah, it's just I mean, just also for the history. I mean, in the past, Bellona and WWF have tried to push the the EPS, well, the carbon performance standard at that time. But at that time, we were limited by this recast rules. So there were some limitations of what you could change. Okay, so this was, unfortunately, it didn't work out last time. But 120 grams, this would basically require CCS on gas combustion. I mean, this is the level which would force CCS on gas combustion. But as you said, Agnese, this is really for the energy supply industry. Within the EB, we also thought about emission performance factor, we call it. So we take the ETS benchmarks as a given. It's a given, like the best in class. And whoever is beyond the benchmark should pay a multiplication factor, or like a multiplication factor of the carbon price. So you pay double if you are beyond, you pay double. That could be one approach, but also you can, instead of having emission limits, you can also say, for example, on the iron and steel industry, that we have a preference on electric arc furnace route, which are 100% renewables, or we can, start with a certain high ambitious level. So they should be the preferred route of production of iron and steel, and only if you need high quality grades steels for very essential applications to define, then you go in the direct reduction route using hydrogen, green hydrogen, of course. So these kind of things, and then also some electrification obligations for the crackers in the chemical industry. So it's not really a fixed limit. It's a more obligation to change the process, I would say. And then there are many other things like, on the circular economy, in cement and steel applications, for example, where you can gain a lot, which are not per se emission limit values, but which are kind of promoting circular production models, which will also reduce CO2. I mean, this is just some ideas. I would even say we can have a fuel ban. We can have a fuel ban. We can a fossil fuel ban. If you just say you need a certain carbon intensity of any fuel you are using, we can define it and propose it with some, linear decrease obligation. For example, there are so many things you can do in legislation, but what will fly, what will work is another story. But yeah, so this is a few thoughts. And the energy efficiency can also do the job in the other way around. If you want to target coal combustion or lignite combustion, for example, you'd pick energy efficiency net rate, which will, as I said before, it will kill all the old boilers, because they will never invest. And then you cannot have this counter argument by industry. Oh, you are limiting our fuel choice. You are, this kind of limitations in the treaty. Member states are free to do whatever they want. We just say, if you want to burn your stuff, you do it under this condition. And it's BAT, by the way. So we just fix the level and up to you, So we have to think about those kind of pro and cons as well when we propose, mandatory move obligations.
Okay, I think that was Michael who was asking if we would agree that the inclusion of CO2 under DIRECTIV will also help industry in meeting ETS performance benchmarks and improve those benchmarks. Well, yeah, from what you've just mentioned, Christian, that could be a way, or could be a result of this. There should be stronger. So depending on the sector, is probably like the limit would end up being stronger than the benchmark as they are today. considering the improvement, the annual improvement is very, very low. But yeah, this is the case by case examples should be ironed out, definitely. Just maybe something that could be interesting for the people listening, especially the NGOs. I've already been met with some pushback by industry on this topic. And for example, one of the questions that was thrown on the table was, is this going to increase a lot the administrative burden on industries to include greenhouse gases in the Industrial Emissions Directive? This, or like a complaint more than a question, or a reason not to do it. And another example, or let's say something that I recently was met with was a sort of what's changed in the framework. So why now? Why do we want to consider this inclusion? And because we know we have the emission trading system, we have the Industrial Emissions Directive. These are two tools that regulate two different type of emissions. We don't want double regulation. There's another one that you're going to hear very often as a justification for not doing this, that we don't need two directives that regulate the same thing. But as I've illustrated, they have two different approaches, and sometimes two different regulations that have different approaches can complement each other and not overlap. So yeah, this is definitely something that we can push back on. So there are many reasons, and we have already, in fact, on this subject, written a briefing with Christian that you can find on our respective websites. If you want also more details and have a good, I think, overview of the two different approaches, how the Industrial Emissions Directive and the emission trading system approach the greenhouse gas emissions, direct, indirect, what the resource use, for example, and fuel. So these are, if you want more information on these elements, we'll need, yes, go Christian.
Just also one suggestion, in terms of the benchmarking, like also to be able to influence the benchmarking, we need to have access to the data. And I'm not sure this is currently the case, that we have data to this, energy consumption data, or best in class performance. And this is something we also face in the BREF context. They say this is confidential business information, we cannot share it, even if it's used for defining a standard. And I think in this case of the ETS, even free allocation, I mean money going to them, which is kind of quite impressive, I would say, in terms of EU decision-making procedures. So I think this is something we need to fix as well. And also, use the HEAP kind of, they want an environmental monitoring framework. Everyone asks under the taxonomy to have some benchmarks, some reference points. So how can it be that we don't even have the carbon intensity or the environmental footprint index, of our biggest industry, and compare them, benchmark them? And I think this is something I wanted to insist a bit more in my presentation, but I rushed it through. But I think this is something very important, and that's why I also want to highlight again the emission performance, the EPRTR review, like the transparency and access to documents is so important as well. Just that also industry, they report in a different way, and we can benchmark them faster. So maybe this can also do the job to, you want to be green, you want to be good, and to get more transparency around that, benchmarking would be very important as well. So yeah, maybe we should also in the ETS review also highlight that, how to get data on the benchmarks.
Well, yes, in DTS, we're experiencing some of the same problems in terms of data availability and transparency, especially when the requests come from NGOs, but in general, also in the expert group. There is sensitivity around this data, and so this is always used as a justification for not disclosing the relevant ones. But indeed, also for the consultation on the update of the ETS benchmark, this is always a point that is made. Okay, so, but I guess if we don't have additional questions, I think we've had a very dense session. We will share the slides with the relevant links. All right, I think we have one more, just the final one.
Yeah, it's a good, I mean, Svetlana, sorry. Yeah, I agree. Like, it should be like a fundamental right. I mean, we have also the Aarhus Convention, you know, about, but it relates to emissions into the environment. And I think this is a tricky thing, because some may argue that, okay, the energy consumption, I mean, here, clearly, it's related to emissions in the environment, because you use fuel of a certain type, so it will end up, you know, in terms of environmental profile. Yes, but in the case of what we have in the BREF, we are struggling now to get the production volumes for the polymer production sites, and we will go to the ombudsman about that, because we didn't get the full questionnaire, and they still think it's a CBR information. So yeah, we say it should not be a confidential business information, because it's about standard setting. And well, you will hear from us on that one. And I think this is a tricky subject, which also connects to what you said, Agnese, the expert groups, the commission expert groups, on how transparent they are, who decides, what are the rules. I mean, it's like the common thing, you know, that the devil is in the detail, and it's shifted in these so-called expert groups, where it's a bit opaque and difficult to get transparency on, you know, who actually decides and on what basis.
Okay, we have a request to share our opinion with them. Okay, so we need a strong review. We have the opportunity to review the Industrial Emissions Directive, the ETS, and ask for better transparency. So I would think that if this has been informative to you, we're always, you know, happy to answer more questions later on, as be a reference to you for the Industrial Emissions Directive revision and the ETS revisions are both coming up. Well, I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us. So, like I said, we'll share a slide and links and our contact details, so you know where to reach us. And if everyone's happy with and ask their questions, then I think we can close. And I want to thank Christian again and all of you for joining us today. Thanks a lot. Goodbye, everyone.